Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at A Million and One Gods by Paige duBois. This book is copyright 2014, so we're looking at another recent one here, fairly recent, 11 years ago. Recent enough, considering most of my books tend to be from the 20th century. But that's okay. I've been looking around at some writings on polytheism lately. Had a couple episodes on polytheism, and I thought I would dive into this one for a further examination of what polytheism is. And I should forewarn you that this author, as is somewhat evident from the writings, is a progressive or left-leaning individual, which is often the case with university professors, which she is. It doesn't come through really strongly in this book, but it does come through a little bit here and there. But I didn't feel like it was overpowering the narrative, so I went ahead and read it, and I want to talk about it a little bit. But it's obvious also from some of the other books that she has written. She's been writing for a while. Her first published book was in 1982. This is not her most recent. I think she had another one 2015. But one of her books is actually titled Trojan Horses, Saving the Classics from Conservatives. I haven't read that one. It's probably pretty interesting, but I think it's obvious where she stands just from the title alone, Saving the Classics from Conservatives. Get your hands off the classics. They belong to us like everything belongs to them, right? The classics are when the conservatives write or speak about the classics, ancient Greece, there's a concept that amongst leftists and amongst progressives that somehow the conservatives are co-opting something that doesn't belong to them, that are taking something inappropriately that doesn't belong to them. And this is the case for just about any field of study, whether it's evolutionary psychology or anything else, that conservatives are somehow invading spaces that don't belong to them. They're intruding on the educational institutions and the intellectual exercises and the fields of study that all by default really belong to the left. That's a common mindset that we see, but we just have to deal with it. That's the way they are. And as I said, that doesn't come through in this book so dramatically that I felt like it was an impediment to talking about it. Although I will say she does connect polytheism with dedication to democracy. And there's some validity to that kind of approach. You know, many gods with different things, different domains of expertise and of influence. One god of war, another god of love. It sort of leads us to think that there may be one set of people who know something. Perhaps the priests of Ares should be consulted in matters of war, and the priestesses of Aphrodite should be consulted in matters of love. We can see that there may be a sort of analogy here between democracy and polytheism, but we can only take it so far, because even among the democratic Greeks, we do see that Zeus is the king of the gods. He is the master of the gods. He has to contend with them. Zeus can't be a complete dictator, I don't think. But it's also not the case that Olympus is a democracy. Olympus is not a democracy. Zeus is in charge. So this can only be carried so far, I think. But I do want to talk about that a little bit in this episode. Like all my episodes, I've got a few spots to read here. And I want to talk a bit about polytheism, how we understand polytheism today, the political implications of it. And I also want to dive into a few of the Greek gods that she talks about. She talks about Hinduism a little bit. That's not clearly my area of study. I'm much more interested in ancient Greece because I'm interested in Western civilization. And ancient Greece is, in many ways, the origin point of our civilization. And much of the ancient Greek ideas can be traced back to polytheistic Greek religion. So that interests me as a foundational point of our civilization, much more so than I'm interested in Hinduism. Hinduism certainly is interesting in its own way and in its own domain, but that's not my field of study here, and it's not nearly as relevant to our modern political circumstance, which is another aspect of my show. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump in, read a few sections, and discuss what I've read. First off, I want to get right into, in the beginning here, when she talks about what is polytheism. She says, quote, "The word polytheos, belonging to many gods, first occurs in ancient Greek. It was used by the refugee Danaids, daughters of Danaus, Greeks by descent, Egyptian by appearance, as early as Aeschylus's tragedy, The Suppliant Women, of about 466 to 459 BC, to refer to the site of the asylum they seek. These maidens are fleeing their cousins, somehow more fully Egyptian, who want to marry them without their consent. The women call on the Olympian gods, the gods of the heavens, as well as the ancient gods below possessing the tomb, that is, the Greeks' chthonic, earthly gods, and Zeus, savior, keeper of pious men. Their father, in the city Argos, where they have found a temporary refuge, urges them to call on some of the many gods of the Greeks, Zeus, Apollo, Poseidon, Hermes, and he commands them, 'All gods, here at a common altar worship, settle on the sacred ground like doves, clustering together, fearing the winged hawks who hatefully pollute their very blood.'" The word polytheos itself occurs at line 424 of this tragedy, where the chorus of maidens cries, "See me not seized from the seat of the many gods," in a verse that emphasizes the multiplicity of the religious practices of the ancient Argives, and all the gods present who protect these maidens. The predatory Egyptian suitors, threatening their own kind, their cousins, appear to be another kind of polytheist, those who worship the deities by the Nile. The voices liken the pursuing suitors to crocodiles, to two-footed serpents, to spiders, to foot-biting adders. The Greeks, from early on, read the Egyptians as consummate polytheists, with their animal-headed, hybrid, human-animal gods, and they will appear again in this book as we see them set against the monotheists of the Hebrew Bible, in the great distinction of ancient Near East that condemns those who worship many, and therefore necessarily false, gods. Aeschylus's tragedy stages a conflict of gods, as the herald of the Egyptians asserts defiantly that he does not fear the gods of Greece, who neither reared him nor brought him to old age. The 5th century BC Greek historian Herodotus provides an account of a more harmonious encounter between the gods of the Greeks and those of Egypt. His work on other cultures suggests the possibility of the translation of names, that different peoples simply call the same gods by different names, but that the many gods themselves are constant and present in those societies that the Greeks themselves encountered in their exploration and colonization of the shores of the ancient Mediterranean. The Greeks, here in Aeschylus's tragedy, seem to take pride in emphasizing the anthropomorphism of their gods, their human appearances, civilized, when compared with the animal gods of the barbarians. They remain polytheists for many centuries, even as the Olympian and chthonic gods of Greece began to share devotees with philosophers who expressed doubts about the gods. The pre-Socratic Greek thinker Xenophanes, for example, conveyed skepticism about divinity when he said, "But if cattle, horses, or lions had hands and were able to draw their hands and perform works like men, horses like horses and cattle like cattle would draw the forms of gods and make their bodies just like the body each of them had. Ethiopians say that their gods are snub-nosed and black, Thracians blue-eyed and red-haired." Yet, popular devotion continued, unmoved by such doubt, in ancient Greece. The mystery cult of the goddesses Persephone and Demeter, for example, persisted for many centuries to come. End quote. Okay, so we see here a couple things. First, the use of the word polytheos. The word was in ancient Greek, and it was used in Aeschylus's tragedy, The Suppliant Women. And I think there's a few interesting things to point out here about this tragedy and how Aeschylus uses this word. I haven't read The Suppliant Women, but we see a couple things here. There are women, the Danaids, who are daughters of Dionysus and Greek by descent, but Egyptian by appearance. Now, what does that mean? If they're Greek by descent, then that means they're ethnically Greek. They're Egyptian by appearance. I think that would probably mean maybe that they have some Egyptian appearances. There may be Egyptian blood that has mixed into their bloodline, but they regard themselves as Greeks, and they probably have adopted Egyptian culture. They live in Egypt, I believe. That's the impression that I get. They live in Egypt. They have adopted Egyptian clothing, I would guess. Maybe Egyptian hairstyles and jewelry and whatnot. Maybe they speak the Egyptian language. But they're Greeks by descent, and they seek asylum among the Greeks because they are fleeing Egyptians. She says the maidens are fleeing their cousins, somehow more fully Egyptian. Well, I don't think that's a mystery how they're more fully Egyptian. They may be related through some marriage. Somehow they may be related to these Egyptians, or they may just be referring to other Egyptians, their fellow, as I said, I haven't read it, but perhaps their fellow Egyptians who live amongst them. But she says that they're cousins, but they're more Egyptian. So they're not of the line of Greeks. They're not Greek by descent, these cousins. They are brought up amongst the Egyptians. And they want to marry them without their consent. Well, in other words, they're rapey Egyptians. They want to take these women as their own without the women consenting. So the women look for asylum, and where do they go but to their ancient ethnic homeland, the land of their forefathers? And they call upon the gods of the Greeks for their protection. And we see here there's something fundamentally ethnic about the polytheistic ways. The Egyptians have their Egyptian gods, and those, as the Egyptian cousin says, he has no fear of the Greek gods because they're not the ones who reared him or brought them to old age. The Egyptian gods are the ones that these Egyptian cousins are dedicated to, and the girls, the maidens of Greek descent, of Greek lineage, they, in their moment of crisis, turn to Greece and to the gods of the Greeks for protection. There's obviously something sort of ethnic here. There are the Greek gods and the Egyptian gods, and there are the Greek people and the Egyptian people. It's not just a set of gods and another set of gods, but it's these gods of these people and those gods of those people. So that's something that I think is important here, and that even in Aeschylus, the father of these girls basically says, "Come here to this altar, all of you, gather here, worship the gods, all the gods of the Greeks. Come to this sacred ground like doves, cluster together in the temple, and, fear the winged hawks who hatefully pollute their very blood." So there's a sort of pollution implied here from the Egyptians marrying these girls against their will. And there's at least an echo of some sort of ethnic purity that is desired, and that being taken by these Egyptians will result in a sort of pollution. These ideas were present in the ancient world. They were not scorned ideas. If someone were to write such a play today, I think they would be canceled, so to speak. They would be subject to some very severe criticisms if they were to write something like that today. But the author here doesn't. She seems to sort of not accept or get this. She says, somehow. The Egyptians are more Egyptian. That doesn't seem hard to comprehend to me. But yeah, then you can compare that to monotheism, and particularly to Christianity, where you have one God, that's the one singular true God, and all other gods are false gods. Then the expectation is that if things were to go correctly, according to the Christians, if they were to see their religion, if they were to see the people of the world accept the truth, then that would entail all the people of the world accepting their religion. because there's no one God for the Christians and then the other God for the other people. The other people are worshiping false gods. They're not worshiping the one true God. And because it has one true God, there can only be one true God for all people, and one true religion for all people. And that serves as a sort of acid dissolving the boundaries between different people, and bringing the whole every knee shall bow or every knee shall bend. That brings the whole world under the auspices of one single religion, and there's a dissolving of differences. And so, to me, it seems like polytheism reinforces the maintenance of boundaries between different groups of people in a way that monotheism does not. But it's interesting how she brings up the pre-Socratic philosophers and the philosophers in general who began to create doubt about gods, about how they were, what they are, starting to propose that, if cattle and horses and lions were able to draw gods, they would draw them in the form of cattle and horses. They would make them look just like they did, just like the Ethiopians imagined gods that look like them, and the Thracians imagined gods that look like them. Here we have a sort of reinforcement of the ethnic nature of these polytheistic religions. These gods represent they look like the people. They're the gods of the people. The Ethiopian gods are Ethiopian. The Thracian gods look Thracian. The Greek gods look Greek. They represent the Greek people. So in one sense, this is a sort of dismissal of the reality of it. Like, well, if everybody has their own sort of gods, how can any group say that their gods are the true gods? The horses would say that their horse-like gods are the true gods. The cattle and the sheep would say their cattle and sheep-like gods are the true gods. But looking from the outside and seeing how all these different people have gods that just happen to resemble them, how can we really think that they are real? They're just invented. The implication is that they are invented, which is an interesting development from the ancient world. But obviously, she says that these philosophers did not overcome the temperament of the people. The gods and goddesses continued to be worshipped for centuries after the philosophers made their point. So that's an interesting and important aspect of polytheism that we should sort of hang on to and not just forget about conveniently or sweep under the rug the ethnic distinction involved in polytheism. So, moving on, she says, quote, "The Oxford English Dictionary defines polytheism as belief in or worship of many gods, or more than one god. In the Christian context of the early use of this term in English, the term polytheist refers to pagans or even heathens. There is a significant distinction made here between belief and worship, as if the two were separable. One can believe without worshiping, or worship without believing. The latter could refer to a circumstance like that of Pascal's famous wager, in which he argued that one could perform the rites of a pious person, and that such a stance might make sense, since if the god and afterlife did exist, one would gain by performing acts of piety, and if they did not, then the effort was pointless but worth the wager. The dictionary entry also alludes to the possibility that a polytheist might believe in or worship many gods, but also, as an alternative hypothesis, that he or she might simply worship more than one, that the smallest addition to one, say one other god, would make for a polytheist. Is there a religion with two gods? And does not monotheism often posit a god of evil, in addition to the patriarchal one, a god or devil in which one believes but does not worship? The author of the dictionary entry capitalizes the word God, as if to suggest that the monotheism of Christianity, or of the makers of English dictionaries, requires that the name of the one God of this tradition be capital G God rather than lowercase g God. If there is only one, his name is God and he receives a capital letter. I often find in translations assigned to my students where an ancient Greek author has sung, spoken or written necessarily without capitalization, since papyrus and manuscripts for many centuries did not mark this distinction, the god did X. That the translator, especially in earlier translations, perhaps more marked by an assumed universal monotheism, Christian or Jewish, renders this being as capital G God. And I point out to them that this distorts the Greek, since often the author is simply referring to whichever god is most present in the text at the time, Apollo or Zeus, or even just a god, one who appears in the work without having a specific name. Plato, for example, has Socrates in his Apology, his defense speech before the Athenian jurors who condemned him to death, that a god, or the god, commanded him in oracles and dreams, that a prophetic voice prevented him from performing certain actions in the past. Are we to understand that this god is Apollo, a divinity especially dear to Socrates? I don't think we are to understand that Socrates was a monotheist who worshipped God. End quote. So the first part of that section, she's talking about how a couple things. There's a difference between believing in and worshiping gods. You can believe in a variety of deities that you don't worship, or you can even worship a deity that you don't believe in if you're buying into Pascal's wager and going through the motions of worship in a god you don't believe in, hoping that you can, just in case, solidify your position in heaven in the afterlife. And then the alternative, of course, would be to believe in a god that you don't worship. And she brings up the concept that actually in monotheism, there really is, in a way, two gods. There's Yahweh, God, and then there's the devil. And many would say, well, the devil's not a god, he's a fallen angel. But he's clearly a supernatural entity that is incredibly powerful, can affect events in the world, can affect people, can take people's souls and corrupt people and do all sorts of supernatural things in the world with using the sort of powers that would ordinarily be ascribed to a god. So in a way, we could understand Satan as an evil god, although Christians and Abrahamists won't like to use that terminology because they wouldn't want to consider themselves believing in more than one god. But they believe in something that sort of fills the role of an evil god. But what I really like about that section is the way I feel validated for my concerns about the translations constantly translating when the ancient Greeks talk about gods, a god, the god. It's always translated to be God with a capital G. And we read this, and especially the commentaries, like even Edith Hamilton's commentary, where she constantly refers to various ancient Greek thinkers as talking about God, whether it's the ancient playwrights or the ancient philosophers, always having some sort of statement about the nature of God. But very few and far between, I think, if any, of these ancient writers, possibly the Stoics or possibly the Neoplatonists, were talking about anything remotely similar to what we would consider to be God. They're not monotheists. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, these are not monotheists. This distortion has been going on for a tremendously long time, and it starts as a distortion of translation, and it morphs into a distortion of understanding. So I'm really glad that she calls that out and says, actually, that's not what they said. It's poorly translated, and it's deceptive. I appreciate that. Anyway, let me keep moving a little bit further into the book when she continues talking about the idea of the monotheism of the pagans. So, along those same lines that I was just discussing, she says, quote, "In the study of Roman religion as well, there is at times an unseemly rush to find monotheism in pagan culture, as if to redeem the pagans, the ancient Romans, from superstition and backwardness. Recent work in the field of late antiquity has explored the question of so-called pagan monotheism. It was argued that monotheism, for the most part quite independently of Judaism and Christianity, was increasingly widespread by the time of late antiquity, certainly among the educated and in particular in the Greek East. The contributors to pagan monotheism in late antiquity find monotheistic ideas in philosophy, in the idea of one divine essence, in the address to the god as opposed to a named divinity, in worship of one highest god in Gnosticism, not yet Judaism nor Christianity, but tending in these writers' views to monotheism. In the later volume, entitled One God, Pagan Monotheism in the Roman Empire, the editors Stephen Mitchell and Peter Van Nuffelen note in their introduction, monotheism today seems not only to have triumphed historically, but also to be morally superior to polytheism. This is one of the reasons why the study of paganism is often segregated from historical work on early Christianity or Judaism. The editors of this text find more nuance and subtlety in the pagan writers and call into question a pagan embrace of monotheism before the Abrahamic religions came to dominate. In general, while they attempt to explain the difficult transition from paganism to Judaism and Christianity, seeing not an abrupt break but a gradual evolution, as is fashionable today, as Mitchell and Van Nuffelen stress, scholars raised within monotheism also have a tendency to view ancient religion through a filter of assumptions, experiences, and prejudice. Some may even be said to want to rescue their ancient Greeks and Romans from what they see as the intellectual, spiritual, and social untidiness of polytheism, perhaps unconsciously imposing a teleology, a shape, to the inevitable progress to history, and discovering a monotheism where it does not exist. There is definitely pressure from some schools in the philosophical tradition towards unity or monism. The Stoics advocated a unity of the cosmos. The Neoplatonists, especially Plotinus, produced a synthesis among the Platonic forms, the good, the one, and intermediary emanations, in a monism that was integrated with Abrahamic monotheism by Christians such as Augustine. Yet, in popular culture and practices, certainly, the polytheism of ancient Greece and Rome persists for many centuries, even though it is difficult to approach it from within a horizon of hegemonic monotheism. I myself am guilty of characterizing Sappho as a worshipper of Aphrodite, the one goddess, when, in fact, she, like others in her culture, worshipped many gods. Although I don't advocate for the return to the worship of the ancient gods, as some do, we might think more about the ways in which our residence in a predominantly and dominant monotheistic cultural setting, one that has been defensively, even militantly attempting to patrol and police monotheism for millennia, has had its effects on obscuring the nature of ancient societies. End quote. So here again, it's just sort of reinforcing what I was just saying, how many people find monotheism in the philosophers. They're very ready to accept that the philosophers were monotheists, or they were reasoning their way to monotheism. They had discovered monotheism through rationality. Or the philosophies of the Stoics or various philosophical schools were essentially monotheists. And even, what is the most surprising to me is not necessarily the philosophers, because, maybe it's the case that the philosophers could potentially reason themselves to believing in one most powerful deity, or that there's only one true deity, a deity on another level than the common gods of the common people. It's reasonable to think that maybe some philosophers may have come to that conclusion. There were a lot of philosophers with a lot of different ideas, and some of the philosophical schools do sort of lean that way, like the Stoics. Nevertheless, it is, in my opinion, greatly exaggerated by modern Christian thinkers who speak about the ancient Greeks, and by translators. It's overemphasized, it's blown out of proportion. They're very happy to find that, and they're very reticent to admit that they're studying the philosophies of ancient pagan polytheists. But anyhow, let's keep moving along. I want to jump back in the book a little bit. That was a much later section. I want to jump back a little bit where she talks about some of the dangers of polytheism and paganism, and perhaps influencing some of the reasons why we're so hesitant to embrace it. She says, quote, "There are dangers inherent in some new forms of paganism, deriving from Nazi ideology, for example, forms that perpetuate racist and anti-Semitic ideologies, at times in the guise of music such as black metal. Moshe Halbertal and Avishai Margalit, in their valuable treatise Idolatry, trace the history of paganism and its associations with idol worship. They demonstrate that in the Hebrew Bible, the root metaphor for the understanding of idolatry is the marital relation. The metaphor is anthropomorphic, adultery exemplifying a flawed personal relationship that is then extended to the relationship between worshiper and divinity. The sin of idolatry is whoredom. In subsequent developments of the concept, especially in the context of Judaism, idolatry comes to signify rebellion against God as sovereign, improperly anthropomorphizing the deity, using pictorial representations to depict him, worshipping an intermediary, worshipping the wrong object wrongly. Eventually, the meaning of idolatry extends to the worship of something else besides God, money, for example. Finally, an inversion. In the hands of Nietzsche and neo-pagans, paganism is celebrated. Nietzsche articulates the opposition between the non-pagan God and the pagan gods as one between the uninstinctual, transcendent, emasculated, life-denying God and the heroic, instinctual, life-affirming gods. These ideas, misread, some would argue, lead eventually to the horrors of Nazism and its descendants, violent, Arianist neo-pagans. Perhaps some of the current prejudice against polytheism and polytheists derives from anxiety, the misrecognizing of all polytheists as espousing these ideologies of hatred and genocide. End quote. So, in the previous section, she had said, if I jump back to the other section there, that she doesn't advocate for return to the worship of the ancient gods. And I'm not sure that, there's no reason why she would advocate for that or advocate for monotheism or advocate for polytheism. She does in many locations in this book criticize monotheism and try to point out that monotheism is in its own way sort of polytheistic. The Trinity has its own kind of polytheistic echoes, and then there's the veneration of the Virgin Mary and the plethora of saints that are venerated, that there's sort of polytheistic echoes in some of monotheism. She doesn't come across in this book as a particular fan of monotheism, but she also says she doesn't advocate for the return of paganism, and perhaps this is why, of course, like many in the modern world, the greatest threat in existence is Nazism, and Hitler is the new Satan. She adopts the new religion of who is the true and what is the true ultimate evil in the world. And there is no evil in the world greater than Hitler and the Nazis. And so she says that paganism can be dangerous insofar as it can bring about return to Nazism, forms that perpetuate racist and anti-Semitic ideologies, at times in the guise of music such as black metal. I like how she uses the word guise, as if the whole music of black metal itself is a sort of ruse, a disguise. I mean, that's what a guise is, a disguise for a deeper racist, anti-Semitic Nazi ideology. Maybe. But she brings up how Nietzsche just inverts the entire concept of idolatry and says basically that there's an opposition between God and the pagan gods, and this opposition is not in the sense of fidelity versus infidelity, but is the distinction between a life-denying, uninstinctual, emasculated God, and then heroic, instinctual, and life-affirming gods. Now that's a section from the book that she's referring to, Idolatry by Halbertal and Margalit. But the point is what she says afterwards, where, if you follow along that line of thought, and maybe it's a misreading of Nietzsche, but ultimately that leads you to something along the lines of Nazism. The connection between what Nietzsche says here, the heroic, instinctual, life-affirming gods, leads to Nazism, and its descendants, violent Arianist neo-pagans. I'm not sure the connection is super strong, but nevertheless, this is just, the sort of typical, the only reason to ever be wary of something, the only thing that could ever go wrong with something is it's always, how can this turn into the next Hitler? There's no concern that, maybe Nietzsche has a point. Maybe there is a certain emasculation, a sort of life-denying quality, a sort of rejection of the instincts, a rejection of humanity, a rejection of our natural ways. And paganism is an affirmation of our instincts and is life-affirming. Maybe Nietzsche's pointing out a particular danger of his own. But the author's not going to recognize, I don't think, anything dangerous. Although, like I said, I don't think she's the hugest fan of monotheism. Her perspective is she's a feminist. She's described as a feminist. Her Wikipedia page describes her as a feminist. Some of her writings seemed, I haven't read any of her books but like judging by some of the titles, I think that's a fair application of the term. And I think that her criticisms of monotheism are not that it is life-denying or emasculating. I think that her criticisms of monotheism are more along the lines that it is patriarchal and oppressive and authoritarian. Anyway, I just thought it was interesting how we always see the same bad guys coming up again and again. Let me keep moving from there. Moving on, I want to touch on a few of the gods. She goes into a little bit of detail about Artemis, and then she goes into a little bit of detail about Dionysus in another section. And those I want to talk about. I want to talk about Artemis and Dionysus. I haven't really spoken of Artemis yet on my podcast, I don't think, but I do find her to be an interesting goddess. She doesn't go into great detail, but she does talk about her a little bit when she says, quote, "The names of the principal gods bore epithets, verbal qualifiers that connected them with particular aspects of their being, and or with particular localities in which they were worshipped. Artemis, the virgin goddess of wild animals of the hunt, of the Asian city Ephesus, associated with the Zoroastrian goddess Anahita there, and with the Virgin Mary, was in one of her aspects called Agroterra, wild, the huntress, with respect to the battlefield. This divinity, a goddess linked to childbirth and to female rites of passage, worshipped by virgin girls dressed as little bears, was also honored with a procession that supposedly fulfilled a vow made before the great battle of Marathon, when the Athenians, along with other Greeks, but not the Spartans, delayed by an observance of a lunar eclipse, defeated the Persian emperor's army and saved mainland Greece from conquest and incorporation in his huge empire. The Athenians had vowed to sacrifice as many goats as enemies killed, and when they ran out of goats, pledged 500 a year at Artemis Agroterra's festival. Artemis Munichia was associated with the bright moonlight that aided the Greeks in the Battle of Salamis, another victory over the Persians, while Artemis Phosphoros, light-bearer, had given light and darkness to the defenders of democracy during the Civil War at the end of the 5th century BC. She marked the borders that separate civilization from savagery, and her help was summoned in time of war. As Parker puts it, she intervened in situations of a special type. No ordinary battles, but those that form part of a war of total destruction, one that threatens the annihilation of an independent state. Such an annihilation would mean the destruction of temples, agora, a laying waste of civilized forms. Artemis is patrolling the borders. The addition to divine names, then, are many, and mark specific forms of worship in groves, shrines, temples, processions, connected with past events, with particular places sacred to the gods, to aspects of their many powers which are not limited to such simple features as virginity, for example." End quote. So what we see here in Artemis is a couple things. Firstly, the point that she's making is that the gods and goddesses had multiple versions of themselves. So there were multiple names for Artemis. There's Artemis Phosphoros, and there's Artemis Munichia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and there's Artemis Agraterra, and these represent different aspects of Artemis. And there's a whole bunch. She lists a whole bunch for Zeus. Zeus Agorios, Zeus Alexterios. I'm not going to go on. She lists a ton of them. Different aspects of Zeus. And she describes a little bit about what they mean. There's the Artemis Phosphoros, which is related to the light bearer, giving light in darkness. But she also talks about the bright moonlight, Artemis Munichia, and that's the moonlight of a certain particular circumstance, the moonlight that aided the Greeks in a particular battle over the Persians. And I think that's interesting. These gods are not super simple, but they're a variety of different types of gods. In some cases, you might see a god that only has one name, and it only applies in one more limited circumstance, and it becomes a sort of just a personification of a concept. And I've talked about this like with Ananke. Ananke is usually a sort of concept of necessity, but is also personified at times and in certain scenarios. But I don't think Ananke has any of these epithets because she's not one of the major gods and goddesses. And each, of the many, many gods and goddesses, they don't all have a plethora of names. But the major ones begin to accumulate a large portfolio, a large group of things that this god or goddess represents, or a group of ways that this god or goddess manifests in the world. And so when the goddess or the god manifests, like for example, Zeus has one, I believe it is Tropeos, which represents the turn in battle. When a battle is going one way and then switches up and the battle is then going a different way. Zeus has interfered, and it is a particular version of Zeus. It is Zeus Tropaios. That's clearly only one small aspect of the portfolio of aspects of reality that fall under the purview of Zeus. So that's interesting. In order to understand these gods and goddesses, we have to understand their complexity, and particularly with the major gods and goddesses. The other thing that is interesting is how Artemis, one thing that Artemis is about is in war. Artemis is not a god of war, right? Ares we think of as the god of war. Artemis is a goddess of virginity, a goddess of childbirth, a goddess related to things of women largely, also related to hunting, also related to wilderness, and also related to borders and the preserving of borders. Because Artemis is involved in a particular situation in war, which is that situation in which a nation state or a city state is under serious threat of annihilation, such an annihilation that would totally destroy the temples, totally destroy the agora, just a total destruction of the civilization. And in that case, Artemis steps up and involves herself. And as she's quoting someone named Parker, and Parker says that Artemis is patrolling the borders. And of course, the borders really aren't parts of the cities. If you think of the ancient city-states, the center of the area controlled is the polis. And then out on the outlands, out in the boundaries, is in the countryside, right? This is the marshes, the furthest most distant area from the capital, where it's sort of the outback, if you will, the no man's land, the countryside. That's where the border lies. Those are the borderlands, and that's where Artemis involves herself, in the boundaries of the civilization. And so there's certainly a territoriality that is reinforced by the gods and goddesses, and there's a preservation, even of a goddess like Artemis, is still involved in her own way in the preservation of the territory and the preservation of the integrity of the Greek civilization. And the gods and goddesses are roused to the defense of the people, particularly in such circumstances when the annihilation of the people is at hand. If something proves to be a true, serious threat, like the Persians. The Persians were a major threat. It wasn't just a skirmish If the Persians won, they would have totally dominated and taken over and ruled over the Greeks. It was an existential battle. And because it was an existential battle, they called on Artemis to protect them. And I think that's very interesting as well. So now I want to touch on Dionysus a bit. She says, quote, Dionysus is just one of the many gods of the classical city. In his worship, we find a vast range of cultic celebration, including phallic processions, sacred marriages between mortal women and the god, and the magnificent dramatic festivals of the city of Athens, which included tragedy and comedy and brought together the whole of the city in honor of the god. If I focus here on this one god, Dionysus, it is not only because he becomes so important in the development of Christianity in the post-classical world, but also because he is a compelling exemplar in the network of relations that made up Greek polytheism. His worship was never localized, and to catch him in a net may be impossible, but I can try to give a sense of the richness of worship of this, just one of the many gods. Dionysus is called Lucios, the liberator, eater of raw flesh, god of liquid things, wine, sap, semen. He is the god of orgiastic aspects of Greek religious life, possession, and ecstasy. The Homeric hymn to the god calls him boisterous Dionysus of the ivory-wreathed head. When compared to the god Apollo, patron of the Delphic oracle, god of prophecy and philosophy, and a complex divinity in his own right, Dionysus has been described as embodying a different kind of masculinity, erasing the boundary between male and female, and a different class affiliation, appearing as the people's god, in opposition to the aristocratic Apollo. Long thought to be a foreign god, imported from Asia perhaps, the name of Dionysus actually appears in very early records, showing that he was worshipped in Greece itself, in the Mycenaean age, on tablets written in Linear B, the most ancient form of Greek, from about 1250 BC. Dionysus had no fixed site of worship. He was mobile, wandering, and was honored everywhere. The narrative, the myth, recounts that he was born twice, with an exceptional beginning that marks him as extraordinary even among the gods, even though he was not always included in the pantheon of the 12 Olympians. Then, a little bit later, she goes on to say, quote, in many of the myths or stories told of the god's life, the theme is the overcoming of resistance. Seen as a newcomer, bringing his gift of wine, he enters communities in which some residents resist worshiping him. Eventually, he overpowers them, often destroying them in the process. He represents the violent force of liberation, and like Aphrodite, who embodies the sometimes violent force of sexual desire, he can be cruel and ruthless. In works of art, and perhaps in ritual as well, Dionysus is associated with a force seeking freedom, the energy to break bonds, often bringing with him an anti-order. He is the other, always present, ready to emerge, the irrational and the sacred, erupting into the everyday, scrambling, orderly, hierarchical, political, and masculine values of the city. He was imagined arriving in Greece from India, the East, with his followers, escorted in a triumphal chariot as he comes. Vase painters often depict him accompanied by this entourage. His devotees make up a thiasos, an unbounded community of those filled with his presence. Worshippers include women, slaves, and citizens together. And in myth and art he travels leading satyrs, wild spirits of the woods, quasi-human, with some bestial part, always with erect penises, their virility not about fertility and reproduction, but about lust, arousal for its own sake. The satyrs are shown in works of art with horses' tails or goats' horns, ears, or legs. Highly libidinous, they are fond of dancing, and are seen at times with Silenoi, older satyrs, often drunken. These bestial characters behave aggressively, sexually, towards women in the company. Dionysus also moves accompanied by nymphs or maenads, women driven mad, who wore fawn skins, carried sacred wands, and performed miracles, making fountains of milk or wine spring up from the earth. Inhumanly strong in moments of Dionysiac possession, they tear up bulls and human beings with their bare hands and engage in the eating of raw flesh, undoing the order of sacrifice, the principal rite of ancient Greek worship. Subversive of neat categories of difference, these possessed women are invulnerable to weapons, suckle animals, and constitute a feminine presence at the heart of Dionysus worship. The women running wild in the mountains, whether real or imaginary, differ from proper matrons, citizen class worshippers of the goddess of grain, Demeter. They represent the other inside, ready to erupt and undo the order of the city. Alexander the Great was represented as a new Dionysus, a conqueror, who went eastward and then returned, bringing with him new ways and new companions. End quote. So she goes on to talk a little bit about some of the circumstances of some of the stories and myths, I should say, of Dionysus and various things he's done. And the part that I skipped over there was a little bit more of the myth. I don't want to get into, the real detail, the nuts and bolts of the myths. You can always pick up this book to get the details. She talks quite a bit about Dionysus, and it's all very interesting. But what I wanted to draw attention to was the sort of subversive quality of Dionysus. He dismantles things. He breaks things. She several times mentions him as sort of erupting through, breaking through the rigid organization of Greek life, defying the norms in opposition to Apollo. And we've seen that comparison several times, which is a very interesting comparison and a very potent comparison. I just want to continue a little bit more talking about Apollo before I get into too much of an analysis. She says, quote, Dionysus, a male god, often has an ambiguous sexual identity, very different from Apollo's. He is shown with long, curly hair, crossing the boundary between masculine and feminine, the liberator from rigid gender categories. Ancient Athens was a society in which male and female persons were usually separated. Women of the citizen class segregate inside their homes. But Dionysus encourages Pentheus to dress in women's clothes and leads women astray, encouraging them to leave home and run wild. Dionysus is the god of wine and of intoxicated ecstasy, of drunkenness, a welcome change in consciousness, especially for the poorer classes of the city. Drunkenness was seen as a possession by something divine, like madness, possession by the god. In the celebrations of Dionysus, a mass phenomenon, the worshipper becomes the divinity, both called Bacchus. There is a blurring of personality, enthusiasmos, as it is called in Greek, the god inside, an ecstasy very different from the order and discretion of the oracular, prophetic god Apollo. The Greeks celebrated many Dionysus festivals, most associated with wine, featuring phallic processions and the opening of the new wine. In one festival, the wife of the king, a priest, was given to Dionysus in a ritual sex act, a so-called sacred marriage. As a god of wine, he was honored as a delight to mortals and a giver of joy, stilling cares and bringing sleep and oblivion from everyday pain and suffering. Thus his worship also sometimes entailed an association between drunkenness and death. Dismemberment is invoked in some of the rituals and myths about the god. Perhaps because of his association with possession, and with the crossing of gender boundaries and the power of actors to assume both male and female personas, Dionysus was also god of the theater in the ancient Greek world. Both tragedy and comedy were not just modes of entertainment in Greece, but were political religious institutions, which some scholars believe were crucial to the development of Athenian democracy, rule by the people. The city held dramatic festivals in Dionysus's honor, and in tragic contests, the stories of the past, mythology, were embodied on the stage in the theatrical resurrection of aristocratic heroes and gods. An actor himself might be possessed by Dionysus, wearing a mask, sometimes dressing in women's clothes, inhabited by otherness, becoming an other on the city's stage. End quote. So I think that it's important to sort of recognize this, and I'll just say there's a tendency amongst those on the right today to look back to the ancient world and see it as extremely Apollonian, extremely masculine. I think even Nietzsche himself does this, although he, in The Birth of Tragedy, which I reviewed way back when, he does talk about the balance between Apollo and Dionysus. That's, by the way, a book I wouldn't mind going back and rereading. It's been so long since I read it, and I've read so many additional books since then that pertain to mythology. I would like to go back and revisit it, but not today. But my point is, on the political right today, there's a tendency to look back to the ancient Greek world and see it as extremely Apollonian, masculine, orderly, vigorous, prophetic, all the qualities of Apollo shining through ancient Greece and making it seem very appealing to us. Those of us who are on the non-Christian right, I'll say, often look to ancient Greece and think there's a certain vigor in the ancient Greek mindset that is, as Nietzsche described, celebrating of life. And then in the more modern Christian world, there has become a sort of morose monastery sort of retraction from the world, diving into the Bible, reading the book over and over again, and not ever looking up at the sun, not seeing anything sacred in the world. All of the sacredness is outside of the world, as Alain de Benoit talked about in On Being a Pagan, which I reviewed also a million years ago. But then on the left, I think the left looks back at the ancient world, at the pre-Christian world, and oftentimes in their opposition to Christianity, they see Christianity, just as the author does, see Christianity and monotheism as patriarchal and stifling. And so they look back to the ancient Greek world and they see the proliferation of Dionysus. They see the wild abandon of dancing in the forests with the nymphs. They just see a real free party atmosphere. And the truth is that both of these views are partly correct. Dionysus was huge in the ancient world, and the sort of blurring of boundaries was something that was important. And yet at the same time, we see that in practice, the genders were separated. And they may have the men may have dressed as women on the stage in the theater, but it was a divided society it was divided by gender, and the men were in the assembly and the women were not in the assembly giving speeches. So it was an Apollonian divided world. It was an aristocratic world in many ways, but it was also a Dionysian world. Both of those things were present in the ancient world, and I think a nuanced view of the past and a nuanced view of where we go from here, if we want to accept that we are entering something like a post-Christian world, and if we want to look back to the ancients for guidance in this time, as I think we should recognize that we're going to have to come to terms with both of these things. I think, as Camille Paglia talked about, the sort of balance between Apollo and Dionysus in the ancient world, and especially in ancient Egypt, she talked about that as well, makes for a strong culture. It makes for a properly balanced culture. It makes for a culture of genius that creates great art and great literature and great theater and does great things and great innovations, because it has found the proper place for Apollo and the proper place for Dionysus in the culture. Trying to reject Dionysus as some sort of cultural contaminant that must be excluded, I think is probably not helpful. And looking at what, where we go from here as some sort of grand liberation where we're going to free all of ourselves from all of our constraints, that sounds like some hippy-dippy nonsense. And that's due to an overemphasis on Dionysus and a rejection of Apollo. A proper society has a place for both of these things, both of these forces. I do have one last section that I want to read where she talks a bit about democracy. And this is, I think, part where her political inclinations start to shine through most strongly. She says, quote, "In her encyclopedic work on Hinduism, Wendy Doniger calls it the Ellis Island of religions. The lines between different beliefs and practices are permeable membranes. Ellis Island was the point of entry of millions of immigrants to the U.S. from the Old World of Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries, from 1892 to 1954. Refugees, political and economic, arrived in huge waves from Eastern Europe, from Ireland, from Italy, to seek their fortunes in North America, and supposedly today a third of the U.S. population can trace its family's arrival to Ellis Island. These Americans brought their traditions with them: anarchism, socialism, Greek Orthodox Christianity, Judaism, Hasidism, Roman Catholicism of various stripes, from Sicilian to Irish, Huguenot Protestantism like that of my grandparents. Ellis Island stands for the diversity of the American population, for its pluralism and its polytheism, which has been even further enriched by further waves of immigration from Latin America and Asia. The word democracy, rule of the people, the much vaunted governmental system of the U.S. and other developed, developing, and deliberately underdeveloped nations, including India, comes from polytheist ancient Athens. After being ruled by aristocrats and monarchic tyrants, the ancient Athenians decided in the 6th century BC to rule themselves. In a radical experiment, they began entrusting the roles of government to fellow citizens. At its most democratic moment, the city chose most of its magistrates by lottery. It paid its citizens to attend the theater. It offered the choice of service on juries that provided a living wage for citizens. The only elected office in the city was that of general or admiral, in recognition of the special skills required to wage war. Otherwise, the citizens trusted one another to govern. After service in one of the allotted positions in Athens' administration, the city conducted an audit of the finances concerned, so that no office holder could cheat his fellow citizens. The great historian Thucydides puts into the mouth of Pericles, an exceptional figure among the citizens, this assessment of Athens. "We have a form of government that does not emulate the practices of our neighbors, setting an example to some rather than imitating others. In name, it is called democracy, on account of being administered in the interest not of the few but the many. Yet even though there are equal rights for all in private disputes in accordance with the laws, wherever each man has earned recognition, he is singled out for public service in accordance with the claims of distinction, not by rotation but by merit. Nor when it comes to poverty, if a man has real ability to benefit the city, is he prevented by obscure renown." Often, being singled out for public service entailed the provision of funds for public benefit in the form of theatrical subsidies or ships for the navy, and, as noted earlier, generals were elected. But most public offices were occupied by men chosen by lot to carry out their duties. And then, a little bit later, she says, quote, "Athens' democracy was intertwined with its worship of its many gods. In the course of his defense, Andocides cited Athenian law. If anyone subverts the democracy at Athens or holds any office when the democracy has been subverted, he shall be regarded as an enemy of the Athenians, and may be killed with impunity, and his property shall be confiscated, and a 10th part of it devoted to the goddess." Athenians swore an oath to kill anyone who subverted the democracy, and vowed that they would consider a killer of such a person pure in the sight of gods and divinities. The oath of initiation of the young citizen soldiers, the ephebes, cited earlier, was sworn over sacrifices before the festival of Dionysus. As Robert Parker notes in Polytheism and Society at Athens, "Religion in Greece was not, in chemical language, a volatile substance. It was stable, partly, to continue the metaphor, because it did not react explosively to other polytheistic systems, but could blend or coexist with them. There were no wars of religion in the ancient polytheistic world, because there was nothing for such a war to be about. But it was a stabilizing and conservative factor above all, because its organizational structures tracked so closely those of Greek society as a whole. Every individual's primary and shaping experience of religion was within exactly the structures through which he or she first experienced the existing social order. One's identity as a worshipper of the gods was also one's identity as a citizen." In ancient Athens, even though it was also the site of challenges to belief in the gods made by the sophists and later philosophers, democracy and polytheism went hand in hand, even though, as we have seen, this link has been disregarded, effaced in Western civilization's narrative about itself. End quote. So those two sections that I just read there, they're back to back when she's talking about democracy and polytheism. I skipped out a little bit there where she's talking about the desecration of the Herms prior to the Sicilian expedition. But one guy, she says, Andocides cited Athenian law. He was one person who I guess was accused of participating in this. But the point is that they took their democracy very seriously, and it seems, in retrospect, some aspects of it seem ridiculous, that the decisions were made, people were put into office by lot, but only the generals, because it was recognized that you can't just have a general determined by lot, by random, by lottery. The generals need to be skilled. The admirals need to have certain skills, and so those are elected positions. Then, of course, if you look at the decision to send the military to Sicily, which was a decision made in the assembly, not by the generals, you can see that even their system, decisions about whether to go to war or not go to war, lots of decisions that a city-state or nation-state may make require some sort of expertise, and probably having the people in charge determined by lottery seems a little bit much to me, and I think many people nowadays would say, okay, that's a bit much. There are certainly problems with direct democracy having average people are notorious for their averageness and their average intellect and their average capacity. And there's nothing wrong with being average. Many people are average in many ways. I'm average in many ways. But certain things, certain decisions that are crucial for the survival of a nation need to be made by people who are above average. And so I think having a system of elections like we have is probably a little smarter than that. But she also ties democracy with polytheism. And she talks about Ellis Island and all of the people who came over at that time. And she's quoting someone else who says, talking about Hinduism, that Hinduism is the Ellis Island of religions, just absorbing all of these different ideas into itself. And so, there's a connection here. There's a conceptual connection between polytheism and democracy, as I've spoke about earlier in the episode. But it can be taken too far. If you're a diehard, devoted advocate of democracy, you're likely going to find in your examination of polytheism, especially when you're looking at ancient Greece with its democracy, you're going to tie these things together and say, well, polytheism sort of demands democracy, and democracy is born in polytheism. And again, that can be taken too far. Oftentimes, people find what they're looking for. And I'm not so sure that that polytheism necessarily implies democracy. And as you know, if you're a listener of the show, I'm an advocate of a mixed system where we should incorporate aspects of democracy, but we should also incorporate aspects of aristocracy and monarchy as well. And I think polytheism has a sort of aristocratic element. Like there are the 12 major gods. There are many gods. There are lesser gods and greater gods. And the main gods, the most worshipped gods, are sort of the aristocratic elite of the gods. Other lesser gods oftentimes serve these greater gods. So there's an aristocratic elitism in the polytheism of ancient Greece. And there's a monarchy. There's a king, Zeus, king of the gods. There's a monarchy embedded in the polytheism as well. It's not just that polytheism equals democracy, demands democracy, or anything like that. That's taking it a little too far. So in my next episode, I'm going to look a little bit at monarchy and whether monarchy can in any way be associated with some of these pre-Christian ideas. But we'll hold off on that till next episode. Thanks a lot for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.